So for the 18th week of Ordinary Time, I am recording my homily at one of the parishes that I serve. So this is Immaculate Heart of Mary in Cedral Woolley, Washington. And as you can tell, it's a beautiful little church we have here. It's not very often in my homilies I talk about the responsorial psalm, but the response this week really got my attention because it's just so beautiful and it gets at the heart of really our life with God, living in the life of God. And so the response was, "If today you hear His voice, harden not your hearts." If today you hear His voice, harden not your hearts. Now, I would change it just a little bit to make it even maybe a little more potent. I would say, when today you hear His voice, harden not your hearts. So it's not a matter of if, it's just when. And so what I have found in my life that so often God is speaking to us constantly. I mean, in so many little ways, God is speaking to us. And so when He speaks, though, if we're listening and our hearts are not hardened, we can live according to what He's trying to do in our life. Now that for me is what living a life of faith means. Sometimes when we talk about faith, we may think it's just randomly putting our trust out there, but not having any sense of what God is doing, but just figuring, well, I'll step off the edge of this cliff and God will catch me, not literally, but in the things going on in our life. And it's like, that's not exactly what faith is. Faith is hearing God's voice and following it, and having the courage to follow it. It reminds me of when I was much younger, I loved dogs, and so I was always learning about all the different breeds of dogs, and I had dogs for pets. But I remember this video on dogs, and it was about a shepherd in Australia. And so he had trained his dogs, his sheep herding dogs, so that he could be literally standing a mile away up on some hilltop where there's no way he could have even shouted and they would have heard him. But he had these whistles. And so he had his dogs trained so that he would whistle a certain way. And as he did that, each dog would know exactly what his commands were. And so even a mile away, the dogs, you could tell that their ears were all cocked back and listening, because they wanted to hear what the commands were going to be, because then they would move the herd according to what the shepherd was telling them to do. And so I know it's silly, but it's kind of like how God works. God's constantly whispering to us, and we have to really, really listen every day. And when we do, we begin to live a life of true faith, true faith. Now, through the course of this homily, I'm going to talk a little bit about my situation right now as a priest, especially this last year, because there's some ways that God's been working in my life that really ties in with this idea of living by faith, but also to the gospel today. In the gospel today, Jesus encounters this young man, and the young man comes up to him and says, "Lord, tell my brother to give me my share of the inheritance." And it sounds like a perfectly legitimate request, especially since Jesus seemingly was carrying some authority with him and people were listening to him. He figures, hey, maybe my brother will listen to him. But Jesus doesn't respond the way this young man expected. I think this young man expected him to side with him, to sympathize with him and say, you're right. Your brother should give you your share of the inheritance. Jesus doesn't do that. He challenges him. He says, watch out for greed. Be on your guard against greed. Now the young man may have been thinking to himself, no, wait a minute, my brother is the greedy one. He's the one who took the inheritance. He's the one who's stealing from the rest of the family. He's the greedy one. And Jesus looks deeper, right? And he says, no. Watch out for greed in your heart. Because he could see in his heart too that there was a greed that was there. Now, as Jesus talks through this story, the problem is not necessarily the owning the money, right? The problem is not necessarily being wealthy, but it's when the wealth consumes us. It's when the wealth possesses us. and we leave all the other things behind, the most important things. So the reality is with greed, it doesn't matter how much you have or how little you have, you can be greedy. Not you, but any of us can be greedy. A poor person can be greedy. You can kind of see that when the person is always resentful of other people having money. They're resentful of the wealthy. And they're always all for the wealth, being forced to give up their wealth. Why? Because they're mired in their envy. They're never happy. And even if they get money later on in life, they're never happy. Because through the course of their whole life, their mission was just to have more. And so even if they get more, they just want more. They just keep wanting more. Never happy. They're greedy. And because of that, they're miserable. What about wealthy people who are greedy? What does that look like? When wealthy people are greedy, they're not always clamoring for more, but rather they become very afraid that what they have will get taken away. And so they become very defensive, become very protective about what they have. And anyone or anything that may pose a risk to that, they fight off ferociously. But they become very afraid. Now, the reality is, just living here in the United States, we all are tainted in some way. If we're really honest, we're all tainted by greed in some way. Whether it's from this side or from this side. Whether it's envy or whether it's fear. We can all struggle with this. Now, the reality is in the gospel today, Jesus challenges everybody in it, which is perfect because we all struggle. And so, as Jesus talks to the young man who doesn't have the money, he warns him about greed and the dangers of that. But then he tells a parable. Now, the parable is about the wealthy man. The wealthy man who's accumulated all these possessions from his harvest, and he doesn't have enough space, so he tears down his storage buildings and builds bigger ones, right? Because he has so much stuff to store. And then he's going to sit back, he's going to be retired, he's just going to enjoy life. And God comes to him and says, "You fool, this day your life will be demanded of you." A few years ago, I was driving down Interstate 5 and I saw this car. And it was a cheap car. It wasn't an expensive car, but it was also very run down. It was all rusty. Paint job was in horrible condition. And it's the kind of car where, you're almost expecting to see the muffler dragging on the ground as it drives down the freeway. So it was really beat up. But there was a bumper sticker on it. And the bumper sticker said, "Never mind the car, my treasure is in heaven." Never mind the car, my treasure is in heaven. Now, at first I thought, that's great. It really is, because it could not have been put on a better car. It was a rust bucket. There's obviously no treasure in that car. But the thing is that for many of us, we own as much as we can possibly own, right? So that person, we would assume, couldn't afford a nicer car, because if they could afford a nicer car, they would buy one. That's perfectly natural. In fact, I would say that's how 99.9% of us operate. If you're out shopping for a house, you look for a house that you can afford, and you look at your finances and you say, well, this is how much we can afford. And then, because of loans and mortgages, we actually even push it up a little bit farther, don't we? We extend ourselves beyond our means sometimes. But it's very rare when somebody goes the opposite direction. When somebody doesn't look for the best thing they can own, but settles for something much below their income so that they can use the money for someone else. That's very rare when we do that. We make a personal sacrifice for the sake of someone else. Now, I'm driving by this old rust bucket on the freeway, right? And as I pass by, I'm expecting, now I know this is a stereotype, but I'm expecting to see someone who matches the rust bucket, someone who themselves is probably a little rusty, right? somebody who's probably not the wealthiest person in the world. You can almost imagine, your kids come to you and they say, hey, Mom and Dad, we want to sign up for tennis lessons. So there's a country club nearby, so you sign them up for tennis lessons, and you pull up in the parking lot in your Toyota Corolla, okay? And there's a line of cars. There's a Mercedes-Benz, BMW, Jaguar, Land Rover, and you think, you know what? I'm parking in the back. I do not fit with this class of people, okay? So when you see somebody driving a Mercedes, you totally expect to see that person looking like they can afford a Mercedes. Like they tell you, just how they appear. And I know it's a stereotype. So I'm driving by this rust bucket, and it catches me completely off guard. Because it's this young woman, very nicely dressed. And it just didn't match. I would expect to see her in a Mercedes. Did not match the car at all. And that's when it really caused me to think. It's like, did I just drive right by a saint? Because that's what the saints would do. They would put themselves second to love of their neighbor. In other words, she could have owned a much, much nicer car, but she chose not to, perhaps to use that money then for other people. Right? As rare as that is, it's possible. And this is what Jesus is getting at. This is the core of his message. Jesus is challenging all of us to do something that naturally we would not do. Now, when I was younger and growing up, in my family, I was always the most greedy and materialistic out of all my siblings, by far. And you're probably saying, oh, no, you're probably just being modest. But let me tell you about an instance. We were having dinner one night, and this is just one example of many. We're having dinner one night, and my dad is lamenting our financial woes. We were struggling at the time financially. And I knew that all my dad's friends, my dad was a lawyer, all his friends were rather wealthy. They were wealthy lawyers. They had nice cars, nice houses. And we didn't really fit in with that. We didn't have a nice, we were always comfortable, but we didn't have the same level that they had. And I was always kind of resentful of my dad for that. It's like, why don't we? Why can't we have more and better and nicer things? And I remember we were sitting at the dinner, and I remember I turned to my dad and I said, and I was just a stupid teenager, and I turned to my dad and I say, why can't you do better? Now, parents, if one of your kids said that, how would you feel? And you know what my dad did? He didn't say anything. He didn't say anything. And he didn't punish me. And you know what I learned? The only time that my dad didn't punish me when I did something really bad was because he was really, really hurt. Deep down, he was hurt. Because the reality was that he was kind of like the person in that old rust bucket. He had found a way to turn his life as a lawyer into something more than just money. He became known in our community as a lawyer to go to if you had a client who wasn't going to pay you, or who couldn't pay you, or who was just really difficult. And my dad would take these people in like a shepherd, and he would really care for them, and he would show them a lot of love. And I never saw that. I was never there to see that. After my dad passed away, I saw it. People would come to my mom, they would come to our family, and they would tell us their story. They'd tell about how my dad saved them or helped them or did all these wonderful things. And it was like, now I got it. He was living the gospel. But before, I was just one of the young men in the gospel. I didn't get it. This last year has been one of the hardest years of my life as a priest. And I'm not going to necessarily go into the details of why that is. Suffice it to say, I love my priesthood. It wasn't anything like that. I wasn't thinking of leaving the priesthood, nothing like that. But I was having some challenges in the parish, and I was trying to set a vision in our school that was not well received. And it just went bad. It just was not a good situation. And I'm not going to claim to be the victim. There's things I could have done much better to have made it perhaps go better, or whatever happened. But in the course of it, it became really and truly one of the most difficult years of my life. And in saying that, I could feel sorry for myself. This serves no purpose. But what I began to discover was God took it as an opportunity. And so he saw me getting ground down. And so he took it as an opportunity to build me back up, but different. With a better heart, a softer heart. In a way that I didn't expect. For all the times and all the ways that I had become greedy, that I had become materialistic, God wanted to take that away because it was hindering me from living a life of faith and a life of true love. Now, I remember we were going on a mission trip to Alaska, and I remember grabbing a book off the shelf just to read something over the course of the trip. And it was a book on the biography. It was a biography on Saint Damien of Molokai. You know the story of Saint Damien, and so he was a priest in Hawaii. And there's this moment when the bishop calls all the priests in for a meeting, and he says to them, "We need a priest to go out to Molokai, which is the island where they were having the leper colony." And he says they need a priest. So the reality was, it wasn't just a leper colony, but because they didn't have any hope, because they didn't have anybody to love them, they began to turn on each other, and it became a very, very horrible environment. And so the first priest to volunteer was Father Damien. No hesitation. And I think to myself, would I have that faith? Would I have that love? Now, Father Damien went out to the leper colony with the understanding that he would only be out there a couple months, and the priests would rotate in and out. But as he got out there, he discovered that in order for the people to really soften their hearts and open back up to the gospel, he was going to have to demonstrate to them that he was fully in, that he was going to surrender his life completely to them. In other words, he wasn't going to abandon them, but he was going to love them. He wasn't going to be afraid of getting leprosy. He was going to live in that courage and total trust in God, that God was going to work through it. And God did, in powerful ways. But he had to give himself completely. Total surrender. Completely trusting God, living a life of faith. And he knew in his heart that that's what God wanted for him. So as I'm reading this, I'm thinking to myself, have I ever had that kind of faith? Have I ever lived my life with that kind of faith? And I said it not to make myself feel guilty. I said it because it was beginning to look so beautiful, so attractive. I wanted that kind of freedom. The freedom to not be afraid. In my life, in little ways, I guess I'm like everybody else. When I want to give some money to somebody or to another organization, I think to myself, well, how much can I give where I won't need to necessarily sacrifice? It's not enough. That's not faith. That's the opposite of faith. It's greed. How much can I give? How much do they need? How much can I give, even if it's going to cause me to make sacrifices, because I love them more than I necessarily love myself, in a sense? To have that kind of faith is the opposite of greed. A little later on, I picked up another book off of one of my shelves, and I was going somewhere. I think I was going on retreat or somewhere. And it was a book on St. Francis of Assisi. Now, I've always loved St. Francis of Assisi because when I was younger, I loved animals, right? And so for me, Francis he was that hippie walking through the woods barefoot who's, talking to the animals. And I love that image, but I never really understood Francis. And when I began to understand him, he frightened me because he was so intense. He had this love for poverty. When I first was discerning the priesthood, I looked at the different religious orders and I just ruled them all out. I wasn't going to join a religious order. And there was a couple reasons, but one of the reasons was because they make a promise of poverty. And I found that I couldn't do that. And so as a diocesan priest, we do make a salary. It's not much, but we make a salary, and we're allowed to own things. And so for me, that sounded much more acceptable. I could still build things if I wanted to build things. I could still have things for my own interests. But to be a religious means I would have to give that up. And so I figured, well, I think God's calling me to the diocesan priesthood. The reality was my heart was still hard there. I was listening to God about being a priest, but my heart was still hard. And God was very patient, but it was still hard. When I was reading this book over the course of this last year, and I'm going through this very difficult time in my life, and I'm really starting to open my heart more and really trusting God, I'm listening to the story of Francis, and I'm just getting blown away by his faith. He had no fear. He wasn't constantly obsessed with tomorrow. He trusted God would take care of tomorrow, but he was concerned about today. And in that, he was so free. And as he walked around the countryside, people were so attracted to that. When somebody has that kind of faith, God expands their heart and has them do things that are rooted in total love. And when they have that kind of faith and that kind of love, they're joy-filled. They're irresistible to be around. You love it. It's so attractive. The very first disciple that St. Francis of Assisi had that joined his order was a very, very wealthy man. And when he came to Francis and said, "Francis, I want to follow you," Francis said, "You have to sell everything, all your property." And he was a man who owned a lot of property. And he went and sold it all. He gave it all away. He gave it all to the poor. To have that kind of freedom, does that mean that you have to go sell everything? It doesn't mean that. But what it does mean is Jesus is going to challenge you and me to push away, to root out that hardness of heart that comes from greed, which comes from fear, or it comes from brain jealousy, right? It comes from all of those things. And he wants to push that all aside. He wants to open our heart so that we can truly live a life of faith. One of the mission trips that we went on this last, about a year and a half ago, was we went to Haiti. Maybe it's been 2 years now. Anyways, we went to Haiti. And I brought a group of parishioners down to Haiti. And we go to this orphanage run by this Catholic organization. And I'm thinking, we're going to go down there, we're going to help the poor people, right? We're going to help them, we're going to bring material support, and we're going to bring our know-how and all these things. And we get down there, and it blew me away. We go to this orphanage, and these kids are so happy. They're so happy. I did not expect that at all. I thought, they're poor. Why are they going to be happy? They were so happy. And so as we got to know them and their situation, they were poor. They were very poor. But there was a young lady who was in charge of leading the kids and being the mom of the orphanage. And what I saw was something that doesn't cost any money per se. I saw her love for these kids. And there was a number of other adults who also, they had just a precious love for the kids. And the kids knew it. They knew they were loved. And because of that, they felt safe. And they felt like they could thrive. And so they were happy. But then I look at the adults, and they had to make some really big sacrifices in their life. The young lady who was in charge of the kids in this orphanage and the operations, she was from America. And she went down there, not necessarily planning to spend, years and years, but she had been there for a number of years. And she says, in my prayer, this is where God wants me right now. And that may change sometime. But that's where God wanted her. To have that kind of faith, that kind of trust, and freedom. The freedom that comes from that. All right. God bless.